them. These are our solutions for Check for Understanding that goes along with Lesson 77. So we had 2 pages to complete. We had page 733 and then the very last page in our notebook, page 735. So our Check for Understandings is this one, the problem about response times and the problem about rejecting the truckload of potatoes. So these are both CFU 77. So the first one is response times by paramedics, and they are asking us to test a proportion. So part A, state the hypotheses for our significance test. We are testing whether or not we have improved our response time. So the P here is the proportion of calls in which first responders arrive within 8 minutes. We want to increase our proportion of calls that are responded to within 8 minutes. So what is a type 1 error, consequence, and consequence in this setting, and what's a type 2 error and consequence in this setting? So this is very similar to the fire department problem that we used as an example. Type 1 error would be that we conclude more than 78% of response times are within 8 minutes when really it has not increased. So type 1 is you conclude the null, but the alternative, just kidding, you conclude the alternative, but the null should not have been rejected. So you conclude HA when really it's HO. I'm trying to figure out a way to say that without saying the HO is true, because we're never supposed to word our responses in terms of the HO being true. So you conclude HA when really it's HO. What's a consequence? The city stops trying to reduce response times, which may result in more deaths. Type 2 error, more than 78% of response times are within 8 minutes, but we conclude that it has not increased. Consequence, we spend more time and money trying to fix a problem that has already been fixed. So you can see how I word my responses. Feel free to pause and adjust yours as needed. Part C, which is more serious in this setting, I personally think a type 1 error is more serious because it could cost lives, whereas a type 2 error could end up improving response times even more. So yeah, we're wasting time and money, but it does have the potential to have a positive impact. Whereas for a type 1 error, there really are only negative impacts that would come from a type 1 error. So for me, I chose type 1 is worse because the consequences are negative. Type 2 could potentially have good consequences or positive consequences. Then for our truckload problem, at the very top, before I could decide which error was more serious, I had to list out what each error would actually be. So a type 1 error is when we should use the truckload, but we send it away. So we should make potatoes out of it, but we don't. Type 2 is that we should not use the truckload, but we keep it. We should not use the truckload, but we keep. Well, to me, for a type 1, the result would probably be an annoyed supplier. So like the person that sends you the truckload of potatoes, he could potentially be really annoyed because when his truckload comes back, then he's like, well, geez, our inspection process probably wasn't great because they probably check the truckload before they ship it. So not only are they checking it at the grower, at the distributor probably, but then the receiver is also checking it. So if you accidentally send it back, or you send it back when you shouldn't, your supplier might be annoyed that you sent it back unjustly, I guess you would say. If you make the blemished potatoes, if you keep the truckload, but you shouldn't, you could have annoyed customers. This might annoy your consumer. In this case, I think a type 2 error is more serious for the potato chip producer. If a type 1 error occurred, they would reject a good shipment, and the consequences to them would be that they have to wait for a new delivery, plus they're potentially going to upset their supplier like I just discussed. But a type 2 error a type 2 error will end up in you making blemished potato chips, which might upset your customers and decrease sales. So I don't know about you, but I love me some potato chips. I love all chips. All the chips, I love them. But potato chips, my jam. It's a bummer when you get potato chips that are grody looking, are blemished, especially when they're folded over and like perfect. Sometimes those are blemished and I feel like it's such a waste. So for crazy people like me who really love potato chips, I might become annoyed if more of my bag is the grody chips. So I think this is a very extreme example. Like, I don't know that I would ever stop buying my favorite brand if there were a little extra blemished potatoes. But the thinking is that if you release a bunch of blemished potato chips, your customers might be angry. It could decrease sales. They could return the bag of potato chips. A lot of people return grocery store items. I didn't know this, but like, if the product you buy is not meeting your standard, a lot of people return it. I don't. I just throw it away. So, if I think a type 2 error is worse, then I would choose the largest significance level. So I should be choosing an alpha of 10. How do I know this? Because from our previous solution video, when you increase your significance level, you end up decreasing the chance you'll make a type 2 error. So I knew to make it 10% because when you increase alpha, you decrease the probability of a type 2. So you may want to write that in. If you increase alpha, you decrease probability of type 2. That's very shorthand. Don't write that in if it's just going to confuse you, though. Okay, tell if each of the following would increase or decrease power. We've done something similar to this in the last solution video. This is just in context, though, of our potato problem, and it really is good to try as many of these as possible. So, we changed the significance level from 5 to 10. Because up here, oh, they don't tell us. So, change the significance level to 10%. Well, I'm assuming then it was less than 10%. So, if this is an increase in alpha, it would be an increase in power, because increasing alpha makes it easier to reject the null, which increases power, because remember, power is when you reject the null, correctly reject the null. You take a sample of 250 potatoes instead of 500 potatoes, well, that decreases power. Decreasing sample size means we don't have as much information to use when making a decision, which makes it less likely to correctly reject the null. And lastly, we insist on being able to detect that the proportion of blemished potatoes is 10% instead of 11%. Well, 10% is closer to the claimed value than 11% is, so it becomes harder to reject. Remember, values farther from the null are easier to reject. This is closer to the null, so harder to reject, which means you decrease power. Okay, this is the official end of Unit 7. Now, when we did power in type 1, type 2 errors in class, I was like, oh, so easy. We can do both of these in one class period. And now, after doing the check for understanding for power and errors, I feel really overwhelmed by the amount of stuff that we have learned in this unit. So, if you are feeling that, do not despair. We're going to focus on the things that we feel really good about. So for me, I feel really good about being able to do a test. So I feel really good about the state plan do conclude, the find the probability, the p-value, and deciding whether or not to reject. So basically, up until the power lesson, I'm Gucci. I even feel Gucci. I feel good about confidence intervals and significance tests. It's only this last stuff that I am feeling like, holy moly, that tipped me over the edge. So, what you're going to do, if you're trying to get a 5, if you're an A+ student, is you're going to do your best to wrap your mind around the power of a test and type 1 and type 2 errors. Now, if you're like, ain't nobody got time for that, I don't need to be knowing all that stuff, I'll be satisfied with a pass, I'll be satisfied with a high B, a low A, then your biggest takeaways is understand what power is, that it's when you correctly reject. Understand what the errors are, so understand what a type 1 error and a type 2 error, understand what those are, and know this relationship. If you have all those things from the power and errors lessons, I think that you'll be okay. So that is my advice. What you have coming up next is an overview and a take-home exam. My expectations for your take-home exam is that you guys are working with each other. The only thing that I would strongly discourage, don't just look up the answers. Like, ask a friend for help, ask me for help, but don't turn to the internet to get the solutions unless you're the type of person that teaches yourself how to do the problem with the solution. If you're just a copier, that's not going to do you any good. And we're in the home stretch now. We really need to be understanding what we're learning. So, your test is coming out soon. Your overview is coming out soon. I know it's overwhelming. It's going to be worth it in the end. We are going to be fine. You're going to be fine. So take it one thing at a time, one problem at a time, and you'll be okay. Email me any questions that you guys have. Love you.